April 1945. A narrow dirt road winds through a small agricultural village on the outskirts of Bremen. The morning mist clings to the fields like a veil, and the only sound breaking the silence is the steady hum of Allied military trucks rolling to a stop. British soldiers climb down, uniforms stained with dust and exhaustion from long days of advance. Their rifles are lowered but ready. The war is nearing its end. Ahead of them stand a group of German women, auxiliaries, nurses, clerks, and support personnel. They surrendered only minutes earlier. Their uniforms are soiled from days of retreat. Some hold blankets over their shoulders, others clutch a small bag or personal item, the last fragments of the life they once controlled. They expect questions. They expect hostility. They expect interrogation. What they do not expect is the order that follows. A British sergeant steps forward, his voice firm and procedural. The women look at each other, confused, cold, exhausted. They do not fully understand the demand, nor the reason behind it. But the instructions are clear. Show us your feet. For a moment, by April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from every direction. The Allied push into northern Germany advanced faster than military planners initially estimated. Entire brigades of the German army dissolved into scattered pockets of exhausted soldiers, wounded remnants, and support personnel left behind as the front lines disintegrated. The once rigid formations of the Wehrmacht were no longer coherent armies. They were fragments of units trying to escape westward, away from the chaos unfolding in the east. As the front line shrank, German command increasingly relied on women to fill auxiliary roles. They were not frontline combatants, yet by the final months, the distinction between front and rear was almost meaningless. The Helferinnen of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht manned communication posts, administrative centers, supply depots, and anti-aircraft batteries. Female nurses and clerks moved with fighting units, performing logistical tasks critical to keeping collapsing communication networks alive. Many were not trained for combat, yet the pace of the Allied advance forced them into the path of the enemy. The British and Canadian units pushing through northern Germany encountered scenes that reflected this collapse. Entire columns surrendered without resistance. Captured personnel included not just soldiers, but drivers, radio operators, and civilians in uniform. Among them were groups of German women in military and semi-military service. They were surprised, outnumbered, and unprepared. Many had expected evacuation or surrender under some formalized conditions. Instead, they faced a rapidly moving occupation force whose procedures were largely improvised in real time, but still grounded in military regulation. The British approach to prisoners of war was systematic. Even in the chaos of the final campaign, there existed strict guidelines on how to process those who surrendered. Officers detached from frontline duty to perform identification, record documentation, secure weapons, and search for hidden contraband. Every captured person, regardless of gender, was treated as a potential intelligence resource and security risk. Clothing was inspected, pockets emptied, and personal items checked. This was not simply about discipline. It reflected experience from earlier campaigns, where disguised weapons, escape tools, or coded messages had been found in belts, boots, and lining of jackets. But the collapse of German lines meant British forces now faced prisoners who did not fit the conventional image of a POW. The presence of German women in uniform was still an unfamiliar sight to many Allied soldiers. Their roles were understood, but their sudden and unexpected surrender created a situation that was both ordinary military procedure and something psychologically striking. They were enemy personnel, yet also civilians, mothers, students, and workers drawn into the war. The confusion on their faces mirrored a wider truth. The war had finally reached its irreversible end. Yet the formalities of captivity had only begun. For the British, this moment was not just about the surrender itself, but what came next, the mandatory processing that every prisoner had to undergo according to standing regulations. British military regulations for handling prisoners of war were not improvisations made in the moment. They were the result of years of combat experience and standardized procedures refined since the early campaigns in North Africa and Europe. Even during the chaotic final push into Germany, The guidelines remained clear. Every captured individual had to be identified, documented, disarmed, and medically inspected before being moved to a temporary holding area or transport column. The chain of custody and safety was paramount. Medical checks were particularly important. British field manuals emphasized the need to detect infections, frostbite, trench foot, and untreated wounds as soon as prisoners were taken in. Diseases spread quickly in crowded camps, and untreated injuries could turn fatal. The inspection of clothing and personal effects was not simply a matter of discipline, it was a direct consequence of earlier incidents where weapons, ammunition, detonators, narcotics, and even coded notes had been hidden in garments and boots. Escaped prisoners had previously exploited small concealments to break free, sabotage facilities, or communicate with enemy units. The British had learned from these events and applied that knowledge uniformly. Feet inspections, though surprising to some prisoners, had clear historical precedent. Boots were one of the most common places to hide objects, especially in retreat conditions when soldiers carried fewer bags. In addition, trench foot and frostbite were still present among German forces by late 1944 and early 1945. Soldiers and auxiliaries alike were often forced to march long distances during withdrawal. Removing footwear allowed British medical staff to check for swollen, infected, or wounded feet, conditions that could become life-threatening and required immediate attention. It also prevented the smuggling of escaped tools or weapon fragments into holding camps. British forces followed established processing sequences. Prisoners were lined up, separated by rank and gender when possible, and placed under guard. Orders were given calmly but firmly. Soldiers in charge of processing were trained to remove emotional reactions from the equation. Their goal was security, not humiliation. Identification papers were collected, numbers assigned, and personal data recorded. The flow of prisoners was constant, and the system was designed to be fast and efficient. For many German women captured near Bremen and other towns of northern Germany, this procedure was unfamiliar and intimidating. They did not expect. For the German women standing on the dirt road outside Bremen, the moment the order was given, "Remove your boots, show your feet," triggered a deeply human reaction. War had stripped them of control, but this was something more intimate. Many had never expected to be taken prisoner at all, let alone by foreign soldiers. Now they were being asked to expose part of themselves that symbolized vulnerability, the feet that had carried them through marches, evacuations, and the final rout of the collapsing Reich. There was fear in this request, but also a sense of humiliation. Removing footwear in front of armed men carried undertones of power imbalance. These women had been in uniform, fulfilling military duties even if non-combatant. Suddenly they were no longer personnel with a role, they were captives subject to instructions they did not fully understand. The internal question lingered silently among them: what comes next? It was a moment that reduced the complex machinery of war to a simple human confrontation, one side surrendering autonomy, the other enforcing security. From the British military perspective, the demand was neither personal nor punitive. It emerged from earlier conflicts in which prisoners had hidden crucial items in boots, maps, files, escape tools, even grenades. The late war environment in Germany intensified these concerns. Allied forces were advancing into territory where resistance fighters, SS units, and isolated soldiers still attempted sabotage or escape. Smuggling was not a theoretical fear, it was a documented pattern that had cost Allied lives. Every captured soldier or auxiliary presented a potential threat until proven otherwise. Identification papers could be forged. Uniforms gave no guarantee of loyalty or compliance. Searching footwear was often one of the most reliable ways to detect escape attempts or prevent violence. The British had encountered situations in France and the Low Countries where small metal files were found hidden in boot heels. Interrogation reports confirmed that disguised items were standard issue for some German units. For the soldiers enforcing the order, this was routine. For the women enduring it, it was destabilizing. The clash between military logic and personal dignity defined the emotional core of the moment. Even seasoned guards felt the tension. They did not mock or abuse the captives. But they also did not soften the command. They were responsible for securing the prisoners against any possible threat, and protocol required strict compliance. In this moment, two angles collided: fear and procedure. Humanity and military necessity intersected in an action that symbolized more than a simple inspection. It revealed the fragile boundary between safety and vulnerability, authority and submission, an interaction intensified by the unprecedented presence of German women in a situation historically dominated by men. Beyond the immediate tension of authority and submission, the British procedure carried a clear medical rationale. Marching through the mud, snow, and debris of a collapsing Germany had left many soldiers and auxiliaries vulnerable to foot-related injuries. Trench foot, frostbite, and infected blisters were common among troops who had been on the move for days without adequate rest, clean socks, or proper footwear. For female auxiliaries, who were often less physically prepared for long marches, the risk was equally significant. Inspecting the feet of prisoners served a dual purpose. It was preventative and diagnostic. British medical officers were trained to identify early signs of infection or circulatory problems. Removing boots allowed them to examine skin, check for swelling, signs of frostbite, and fungal infections that could incapacitate a soldier if left untreated. These inspections were essential not only for the well-being of the prisoner but also for camp hygiene. Untreated infections could spread rapidly in crowded holding areas. Foot inspections, though startling to the women, were therefore part of a broader effort to maintain order, health, and security simultaneously. Equally important was the psychological dimension for the Allied personnel. Observing the enemy unarmed and stripped of customary barriers created a tangible sense of control. Years of combat had conditioned soldiers to respect discipline, hierarchy, and uniform, yet witnessing surrender, particularly of women in military roles, confronted them with the human cost of war. The inspection of feet, seemingly trivial, symbolized the absolute inversion of power. It forced soldiers to see the enemy as vulnerable, human, and dependent on rules enforced by their captors. For the German women, this moment carried an additional weight. It was a confrontation with the realities of defeat. No longer were they auxiliaries fulfilling roles in an organized military structure. They were fully exposed to scrutiny, reliant on the mercy of those who held power. For some, the act of removing boots was almost ritualistic, a subtle acknowledgement that the war was lost, that control had shifted entirely. Through this lens, the inspection was more than a procedure. It became a collision of medical necessity and psychological dominance, an intersection where practicality met perception. While soldiers followed protocol to prevent disease and contraband, the prisoners absorbed the same act as a profound humiliation and an inescapable lesson in surrender. Both sides were engaged in a careful, structured dance of authority, compliance, and observation, where every action, however small, carried the weight of war's final months. The intersection of human vulnerability, military logic, and medical protocol set the stage for the climactic moment when the surrender became tangible. The tension, uncertainty, and emotional exposure of the women foreshadowed a turning point, one where the rules of war, power, and survival collided on the small roads and fields of northern Germany. April 1945, northern Germany. The British column halted along the edge of a small village. Dust from the road settled on the shoulders of exhausted soldiers. Among them stood the women, German auxiliaries, nurses, and clerks, lining up as instructed, hands folded or clutching their meager belongings. The air was thick with tension, a mix of early spring cold and the accumulated fear of weeks of retreat. The sergeant stepped forward, clipboard in hand, voice firm but measured. He repeated the command that had sent a ripple of disbelief through the group. "Remove your boots. Show us your feet." It was procedural, yet for those standing there it felt like a moment of exposure unlike any other. Some hesitated, unsure if they had understood correctly. Others exchanged nervous glances, their minds racing to reconcile military duty with personal dignity. As boots were unlaced and removed, the women revealed the marks of their journey: swollen ankles, calloused heels, cuts from marching over debris, and traces of untreated blisters. The vulnerability of their exposed feet mirrored the vulnerability of their entire position. Many had clung to the illusion that being non-combatants might spare them from the humiliations of war. This illusion shattered in seconds. For the British soldiers, the act was almost routine, an opportunity to enforce protocol, secure the prisoners, and confirm the absence of concealed weapons or contraband. Yet even for them, there was a recognition of the psychological weight. These women, trained to serve in organized structures, were now stripped of both authority and control. Their faces reflected shock, shame, and fear, a complex mixture that the soldiers understood, though they were conditioned not to react. In that moment, the surrender became tangible. It was no longer abstract or distant, it was immediate, intimate, and physical. The women's emotional state shifted rapidly. Initial confusion gave way to resignation to quiet acknowledgement. Each foot exposed, each boot set aside, marked a passage from a life of partial control to total captivity. And yet there was still a silent question in the air: what comes next? The inspection was brief but intense. It condensed weeks of retreat, days of exhaustion, and the shock of final defeat into a simple, human interaction. The women, once auxiliaries in a military machine, were now fully subject to the procedures and authority of their captors. And in this confrontation, the first tremors of psychological surrender began to resonate, foreshadowing the complete shift in power that was about to solidify. The removal of boots was more than a medical or procedural act, it marked a decisive shift in power. Until that moment, the German women had maintained some semblance of autonomy, even in retreat. Uniforms and duties had provided structure. Now, standing barefoot on cold, uneven ground, they were fully subject to British authority. Every movement, every glance was observed. Compliance was mandatory, defiance impossible. The sergeant's eyes swept the line, confirming procedure. Soldiers nearby checked documentation, cross-referencing identities and ranks. What had been abstract, the notion of defeat, now became tangible. The war had moved from maps and front lines to this narrow dirt road, a quiet stage where the hierarchy of captor and captive was rendered plain. In the smallest details, the folding of socks, the examination of swollen ankles, power dynamics crystallized. The women were no longer auxiliaries of a crumbling army. They were individuals whose survival depended entirely on the procedures of the British unit. Recognition of the broader reality set in. Many had clung, even fleetingly, to the hope that surrender might preserve dignity, that their roles as non-combatants offered protection. Now they understood that the front was gone, that the Reich was collapsing, and that their fates were dictated by enemy hands. The war was no longer distant. It was immediate and irreversible. Shock rippled through the group. Some swallowed hard, staring at the ground. Others closed their eyes briefly, as if bracing themselves for what was to come. Silence fell across the line. There were no shouted commands, no dramatic confrontation, only the quiet acknowledgement of defeat. The soldiers maintained professional composure, understanding that tension and fear were part of the POW process. Yet the psychological landscape had shifted completely. Where once the German women had carried responsibility, authority, or even a sense of purpose, they now confronted the vulnerability imposed by surrender. In those quiet moments, the full weight of the war's end was present. The British were not triumphant in a celebratory sense. Their victory was procedural, disciplined, and measured. The German women were not merely prisoners. They were living embodiments of the Reich's final collapse, human figures shaped by exhaustion, fear, and the sudden clarity of defeat. This small scene on a northern German road captured the essence of the war's final days, abrupt, intimate, and deeply human, where the grand sweep of history converged in the vulnerability of individual lives. The line of prisoners, barefoot and exposed, stood as a testament to the personal cost of surrender. In that instant, the war had shifted from strategy and tactics to the reality of captivity, setting the stage for the consequences that would follow, both immediate and lasting. Once the initial inspection concluded, the German women were escorted to temporary holding areas behind the British lines. Rows of trucks, guarded by armed soldiers, stood ready to transport prisoners to makeshift processing centers. These centers were often repurposed local buildings, schools, community halls, or barns, selected for their capacity to house large numbers of captives. The air was filled with the low murmur of nervous conversation, punctuated by the occasional barked order from guards ensuring order and compliance. Medical personnel moved systematically among the prisoners. Feet were washed, blisters treated, and any signs of infection documented. Frostbite and swelling were carefully noted, and some prisoners received immediate care, while others were marked for follow-up at larger field hospitals. Clothing and personal effects were catalogued and, where necessary, disinfected or removed. Soldiers verified that no concealed items remained, letters, maps, or any equipment that could aid escape or sabotage. Despite the tension, these inspections were routine and methodical, reflecting the British military's commitment to both security and the well-being of captives. The women were then assigned numbers, recorded in registers, and given identification tags that would accompany them throughout their time in Allied custody. These small, administrative details marked the transition from civilian or auxiliary personnel to formally recognized prisoners of war. While the process was impersonal, it was designed to prevent errors, ensure accountability, and maintain safety in an environment where thousands of surrendered personnel were moving through the same system. Emotionally, the transition was stark. Many women remained silent, absorbing the sudden loss of autonomy. Exhaustion and the physical toll of long marches compounded the psychological impact. Yet there was a strange relief in the orderliness. Despite being prisoners, the predictability of procedure offered a framework, however minimal, in a situation defined by upheaval. It was the first step in what would become a prolonged period of captivity, one shaped by regulation, routine, and the broader mechanisms of the Allied war effort. The inspection of feet, so startling at first, had already served its purpose. It had reinforced authority, secured the prisoners against immediate threats, and addressed pressing medical needs. And in doing so, it also crystallized the larger reality. The war had ended for these women. Their fates were now determined by policies, protocols, and the distant decisions of Allied commanders. What had begun as a simple procedural act had rippled outward, shaping the conditions of their immediate captivity and defining the early hours of their surrender. The administrative and medical processing of prisoners did not end at the initial holding areas. Detailed documentation was maintained for every German woman captured. Registers recorded names, ranks, service branches, dates and locations of capture, and any medical conditions noted during inspection. Photographs of prisoners, often including full body and headshots, were sometimes taken to prevent misidentification. Foot examinations, in particular, were logged meticulously. Medical officers noted signs of frostbite, blisters, infections, or previous injuries, creating a permanent record of the prisoner's condition upon capture. These reports later contributed to Allied analyses of German troop movements, logistical weaknesses, and the health challenges facing retreating units in the war's final months. The procedures also influenced policy evolution. Historical studies and post-war reviews highlighted the effectiveness of thorough inspections, including those that might initially seem unusual or invasive. Foot inspections, previously considered minor, were recognized as a critical preventive measure, ensuring the health of prisoners, detecting hidden contraband, and establishing control. These lessons informed later training manuals for prisoner handling and were incorporated into post-war military doctrine. The emphasis on methodical, humane, and health-conscious processing became a hallmark of Allied POW management, balancing security with adherence to the Geneva Convention. For the German women, the consequences extended beyond immediate medical care and documentation. Conditions in temporary camps varied, but the early compliance with procedure often determined the quality of treatment they received. Those who submitted to inspection without resistance were more likely to be processed efficiently and moved to well-supplied holding facilities. Conversely, any perceived delay, noncompliance, or confusion could result in extended confinement in field conditions, creating additional physical and psychological strain. The simple act of revealing their feet, once shocking and disorienting, had real implications for their safety, comfort, and survival in the first hours of captivity. The broader significance was clear. What began as a minor procedural instruction reflected the intersection of military necessity, medical care, and human psychology. Historical reports emphasize that such detailed attention to seemingly small aspects of surrender, foot inspection, clothing checks, identification, contributed to the overall orderliness and effectiveness of Allied prisoner management. In these moments, the practical needs of warfare and the preservation of human life converged. The inspection of the women's feet became emblematic of how structured processes could assert authority, ensure security, and address human vulnerabilities simultaneously. The scene on that quiet northern German road, women standing barefoot under the watchful eyes of British soldiers, was neither spectacular nor violent. Yet it captured something essential about war, the collision of human dignity with the relentless machinery of conflict. Surrender, often depicted in grand battles or dramatic charges, can be profoundly intimate. It unfolds not only on battlefields but in small, controlled moments of procedure, where authority, compliance, and vulnerability intersect. For the German women, the simple act of removing boots revealed more than calloused feet or minor injuries. It symbolized the abrupt loss of control, the quiet acknowledgement that the war they had served was over, and that their fates were now determined by rules imposed from outside. The psychological impact of such encounters often lingered far longer than the memory of explosions or gunfire. History, in its records and reports, preserves the minutiae of these human interactions, recognizing that surrender and shock can shape the memory of conflict as powerfully as battlefield triumphs. The inspection, procedural though it was, became a prism through which larger truths are seen: the interplay of duty, fear, and survival, the ethical responsibilities of captors, and the ways small, intimate acts can reflect the broader collapse of empires. Moments like these remind us that war is experienced not only in strategy and combat but in the human body, in gestures of compliance, and in the quiet acknowledgments of power.